I hope it will be the yellow men. But Menelek is powerful. It will take many yellow men to defeat him." Crowds were gathering along the sidewalks to view the emperor's entry into the city. I took my place among them, although I hate crowds, and I am glad that I did, for I witnessed such a spectacle of barbaric splendor as no other Pan-American has ever looked upon. Down the broad main thoroughfare, which may once have been the historic Unter den Linden, came a brilliant cortege. At the head rode a regiment of red-coated hussars, enormous men, black as night. There were troops of riflemen mounted on camels. The emperor rode in a golden howdah upon the back of a huge elephant, so covered with rich hangings and embellished with scintillating gems that scarce more than the beast's eyes and feet were visible. Menelek was a rather gross-looking man, well past middle age, but he carried himself with an air of dignity befitting one descended in unbroken line from the Prophet, as was his claim. His eyes were bright but crafty, and his features denoted both sensuality and cruelness. In his youth he may have been a rather fine-looking black, but when I saw him his appearance was revolting, to me at least. Following the emperor came regiment after regiment from the various branches of the service, among them batteries of field guns mounted on elephants. In the center of the troops following the imperial elephant marched a great caravan of slaves. The old street sweeper at my elbow told me that these were the gifts brought in from the far outlying districts by the commanding officers of the frontier posts. The majority of them were women, destined, I was told, for the harems of the emperor and his favorites. It made my old companion clench his fists to see those poor white women marching past to their horrid fates, and though I shared his sentiments, I was as powerless to alter their destinies as he. For a week the troops kept pouring in and out of New Gondar, in, always, from the south and west, but always toward the east. Each new contingent brought its gifts to the emperor. From the south they brought rugs and ornaments and jewels. From the west, slaves, for the commanding officers of the western frontier posts had naught else to bring. From the number of women they brought, I judged that they knew the weakness of their imperial master. And then soldiers commenced coming in from the east, but not with the gay assurance of those who came from the south and west. No, these others came in covered wagons, blood-soaked and suffering. They came at first in little parties of 8 or 10, and then they came in 50s, in hundreds, and one day 1,000 maimed and dying men were carted into New Gondar. It was then that Menelek XIV became uneasy. For 50 years his armies had conquered wherever they had marched. At first he had led them in person. Lately his presence within 100 miles of the battle line had been sufficient for large engagements. For minor ones only the knowledge that they were fighting for the glory of their sovereign was necessary to win victories. One morning New Gondar was awakened by the booming of cannon. It was the first intimation that the townspeople had received that the enemy was forcing the imperial troops back upon the city. Dust-covered couriers galloped in from the front. Fresh troops hastened from the city, and about noon Menelek rode out surrounded by his staff. For 3 days thereafter we could hear the cannonading and the spitting of the small arms, for the battle line was scarce 2 leagues from New Gondar. The city was filled with wounded. Just outside, soldiers were engaged in throwing up earthworks. It was evident to the least enlightened that Menelek expected further reverses, And then the imperial troops fell back upon these new defenses, or rather they were forced back by the enemy. Shells commenced to fall within the city. Menelek returned and took up his headquarters in the stone building that was called the palace. That night came a lull in the hostilities. A truce had been arranged. Colonel Bellick summoned me about 7 o'clock to dress him for a function at the palace. In the midst of death and defeat, the emperor was about to give a great banquet to his officers. I was to accompany my master and wait upon him. I, Jefferson Turck, lieutenant in a Pan-American navy! In the privacy of the colonel's quarters, I had become accustomed to my menial duties, lightened as they were by the natural kindliness of my master, but the thought of appearing in public as a common slave revolted every fine instinct within me, yet there was nothing for it but to obey. I cannot even now bring myself to a narration of the humiliation which I experienced that night as I stood behind my black master in silent servility, now pouring his wine, now cutting up his meats for him, now fanning him with a large plumed fan of feathers. As fond as I had grown of him, I could have thrust a knife into him, so keenly did I feel the affront that had been put upon me. But at last the long banquet was concluded. The tables were removed. The emperor ascended the dais at one end of the room and seated himself upon a throne, and the entertainment commenced. It was only what ancient history might have led me to expect: musicians, dancing girls, jugglers, and the like. Near midnight, the master of ceremonies announced that the slave women who had been presented to the emperor since his arrival in New Gondar would be exhibited, that the royal host would select such as he wished, after which he would present the balance of them to his guests. Ah, what royal generosity! A small door at one side of the room opened, and the poor creatures filed in and were ranged in a long line before the throne. Their backs were toward me. I saw only an occasional profile, as now and then a bolder spirit among them turned to survey the apartment and the gorgeous assemblage of officers in their brilliant dress uniforms. They were profiles of young girls, and pretty, but horror was indelibly stamped upon them all. I shuddered as I contemplated their sad fate, and turned my eyes away. I heard the master of ceremonies command them to prostrate themselves before the emperor, and the sounds as they went upon their knees before him, touching their foreheads to the floor. Then came the official's voice again, in sharp and peremptory command. "Down, slave!" he cried. "Make obeisance to your sovereign!" I looked up, attracted by the tone of the man's voice, to see a single, straight, slim figure standing erect in the center of the line of prostrate girls, her arms folded across her breast, and little chin in the air. Her back was toward me. I could not see her face, though I should like to see the countenance of this savage young lioness, standing there, defiant among that herd of terrified sheep. "Down! Down!" shouted the master of ceremonies, taking a step toward her and half drawing his sword. My blood boiled. To stand there inactive while a negro struck down that brave girl of my own race! Instinctively I took a forward step to place myself in the man's path. But at the same instant Menelek raised his hand in a gesture that halted the officer. The emperor seemed interested, but in no way angered at the girl's attitude. "Let us inquire," he said in a smooth, pleasant voice, "why this young woman refuses to do homage to her sovereign." And he put the question himself directly to her. She answered him in Abyssinian, but brokenly and with an accent that betrayed how recently she had acquired her slight knowledge of the tongue. "I go on my knees to no one," she said. "I